When did we start believing that wanting to be touched after 60 was something to be ashamed of? They whispered about her in the marble halls, the young woman who shared the emperor's bed long after his glory had faded. They called her a distraction, a gold digger, a scandal. But no one asked why he held her hand so tightly in public, or why he smiled softer in those final years. He was 72. His body ached in places that once flexed like steel. His mind, once sharp as a sword, now wandered mid-thought. But in the quiet moments when the torches dimmed and the politics fell silent, he still wanted something deeply human to be desired. Not remembered, not obeyed, just wanted. This is not a story about conquest. It is a story about a man who had conquered the world, and yet longed still to be touched without pity, to love without apology, to want without shame. They said he had outlived himself. The marble busts still bore his youthful face, chiseled, divine, immortal. But when the real man passed them in the corridor, stooped slightly slower than before, the guards straightened more from duty than awe. His empire was still intact, his name still sacred. But there was something about age that made people avert their eyes, as if time were contagious. He noticed it. Of course he did. Once he'd walk into a room, and all conversations would still. Now voices only lowered out of respect, not reverence. And it was in those tiny changes, the subtle way the servants now offered him an arm without asking, or how his generals no longer debated him, but agreed that he began to feel himself being erased quietly, even as he lived. His physician was kind but cautious. "You must pace yourself, Caesar," he'd say, using that softened tone reserved for the elderly. No more late suppers, no wine past sunset. And above all, no exertion. Exertion, as if the body that had once ridden across deserts and commanded legions now had to be protected from itself. He smiled politely, and then privately did as he pleased. Her name was Lycia. She was not the most beautiful woman in the empire. Not in the conventional sense. Not the kind that artists sculpted or poets immortalized. She was young, yes, but not careless. She was not loud nor shy. She had a gaze like water, still on the surface, deep underneath. He met her at a banquet, one of the last he truly enjoyed. She had been seated far from him, among the musicians and philosophers, not among the noblewomen. A guest of a guest, someone's niece or sister, it hardly mattered. But she laughed not loudly, not performatively, but in a way that cut through the fog of conversation like a clear bell. Something in him turned toward that sound. It had been a long time since anything in him turned. They spoke briefly that night. Nothing forward, nothing inappropriate. But she asked him a question about his favorite campaign, and she didn't ask it with awe. She asked it with curiosity, with interest, not in his victories, but in his memory of them. He did not sleep well that night. It wasn't lust, not at first. It was the way she looked at him, like he was still someone, not a statue, not a relic, not a monument surrounded by silent, fearful courtiers. He invited her to the gardens 2 days later, in public, where no shame could be implied. She came simply dressed, hair tied loosely, eyes alert but not expectant. They walked. She asked him things no one dared to ask anymore. Did you ever doubt yourself on the battlefield? What was the loneliest night of your life? Do you ever think of what you could have been had you not become who you are? He answered, carefully at first, then more freely. Her presence peeled something open in him, not like a wound, but like a locked door with a key he hadn't known was missing. Weeks passed. She visited again and again. They never touched, not even a hand. But his staff began to whisper, not out of scandal, but disbelief. Why her? Why now? Then came the night he first reached for her. There had been another sleepless evening, the kind where his legs burned and his bladder woke him 3 times. He sat alone on the terrace robe drawn tightly, watching the torchlight flicker over the stone columns. The moon was cruelly bright, showing every wrinkle, every weakness. He whispered to no one, "Am I still a man? Not a god, not an emperor, just a man." Lycia found him there. She had not been summoned. She had a way of arriving when needed without making it seem like magic. She saw him, not just his shape in the moonlight. She saw him, the ache, the doubt, the humbling grief of time. She didn't bow, she didn't flatter, she simply sat beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "You look tired of pretending you're not still alive." It broke him, a man who had faced war, betrayal, loss, and the deaths of sons broke. Quietly, no sobs, just the silent collapse of armor. She touched his hand. He didn't flinch. He didn't lean in. He just breathed. Later, when they did finally lie together, it was not urgent. It was not wild. It was not some grand, dramatic reclaiming of youth. It was quiet, honest, a kind of closeness he hadn't known he still had permission to want. She didn't look at his aging body with pity. She didn't look away either. She let him be fully there in his softness, his slowness, his desire that trembled instead of roared. For the first time in years, he didn't feel old. He just felt human. The affair, if one could even call it that, did not unfold like a scandal. There were no forbidden glances across the Senate floor, no urgent meetings behind locked doors. Instead, it happened like the slow unfolding of spring, unnoticed by most, but deeply known to those who paused long enough to feel the air changing. He did not hide her, nor did he announce her. She simply began to appear more often, a presence, not a possession. She walked beside him in the gardens sometimes, a few steps behind, sometimes right at his side. She listened during his briefings, eyes calm but alert, never speaking out of turn. And occasionally, when he reached for his goblet or cleared his throat, she was already there handing it to him without a word. People speculated, of course. They always do. The older nobles shook their heads. Undignified, they whispered. At his age, they muttered as though age were a sentence instead of a season. But he didn't care anymore. Not in defiance, not in pride. Simply because the man he had become no longer needed to explain himself to people who had never truly seen him. What he had with Lycia was not about reclaiming youth. It was about reclaiming something far more elusive: permission. Permission to be touched, permission to be seen in full wrinkled skin. Slower hands, quieter breath, and still be wanted. Not as an icon, not as a conqueror, just as a man who still desired closeness, warmth, and the slow rhythm of shared breath in the dark. There were nights when his body failed him. He would reach for her trembling and find his strength not quite where it used to be. And she would not recoil. She would not sigh or look away, or tell him it was fine. She would rest her hand over his and whisper, "We don't need to hurry." And in that softness, something unexpected returned. Not the vigor of youth, but the power of presence. It was in those nights, slow, patient, unhurried, that he discovered what he'd never known in his younger years, that intimacy is not performance. That closeness is not measured in motion, that pleasure can live in stillness. She taught him to breathe again, to be there not to achieve but to receive. And for a man who had spent his life grasping, commanding, acquiring, that was a revolution all its own. He began to write again, not proclamations or decrees but letters, not for public record but for himself. He wrote about what it felt like to grow older in a body that had once been a symbol of power. He wrote about the strange shame of slowing down and the gentler kind of courage it took to allow someone to see you in that state, bare, breathless, vulnerable. He wrote of Lycia not as a mistress but as a mirror that didn't reflect who he had once been, but who he still was underneath all the layers of history and expectation. In one letter never sent, he wrote, "She does not awaken what I was. She reminds me of what I still am. And in her eyes I remember that I have not finished being a man." The guards began to watch her differently, less like a curiosity, more like someone who belonged. One younger soldier even asked her quietly how she spoke to him without fear. She looked at him gently and said, "Because I never speak to the emperor, I speak to the man." It unsettled them. They were trained to serve power, not tenderness. They did not know how to serve a man who wanted neither worship nor obedience, but simply a moment of real connection. But they watched, and slowly they softened too. Time did not stop. His body continued to change. There were more nights when pain won over passion. His sleep grew shallower, his appetite smaller, his steps more deliberate. But he no longer met these changes with shame. Not because he stopped missing what once was, but because he had something now that youth had never given him: acceptance. He began to understand that being desired in his older body wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a performance or a mercy, it was real. Because she didn't come for his power, she stayed for his presence. She touched him not as a reward, but as a response to who he still was. Beneath the weary muscles and aging skin, a man who loved longed, listened, and still burned with quieter fire. In his final spring, the wisteria in the courtyard bloomed early. The fragrance drifted into his chambers through the open windows, mixing with the morning incense. He sat in a low chair, a thick shawl over his shoulders. He no longer wore his armor, not even for ceremony. There was nothing left to prove. Lycia sat nearby, reading aloud from a scroll, her voice soft, unrushed. It was poetry, not about war or triumph, but about rivers, about aging trees, about the way light touches water and doesn't stay. He closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in listening. For months now, his nights with her had been more about warmth than want. The desire had changed, not disappeared, but become quieter, deeper. No longer a chase, but a pulse, a presence. The way her fingers grazed his when handing him tea. The way she smiled with her eyes when he forgot a word, and she remembered for him. He hadn't spoken of legacy in a long time. Not the statues, not the military records. That was the Empire's concern, not his. What mattered now were smaller truths, that someone had kissed his shoulder in the dark and whispered, "You're still here." That's enough. That someone had looked at his aging body and not turned away, not out of duty, but affection. That even after a lifetime of power, he had discovered there was more to manhood than dominance. There was softness. There was surrender. There was grace in letting someone in, not as a servant or subject, but as an equal, as a witness. His physician asked one day, carefully, if he wanted to prepare any final messages, perhaps dictate a few last thoughts to the Senate or the historians. He waved him off gently. Instead, he wrote one final note, not for the Empire, but for Lycia. A short note, nothing grand. "Thank you for not seeing me as who I was, but as who I still am. For touching what no one else believed was still alive in me. You reminded me I am not finished." He passed quietly in the night. No battles, no proclamations, just a final breath and a hand resting in hers. The Empire mourned. Statues were veiled, speeches were made, and the people remembered him as a conqueror, a statesman, a legend. But in her chambers, far from the marble and fire, Lycia remembered something else. A man who once whispered in the darkness, "I'm not sure if I can, but I want to try." A man who had rediscovered desire, not in youth but in trust, not in strength but in surrender. Conclusion lead in to closing reflections. And maybe that's the real story. Not about an emperor defying age or biology. Not about some miracle of stamina or secret Roman tonic, but about what happens when a man allows himself to be wanted, not for what he once was, but for what he still is. When he lets go of performance and dares to be present. When he stops hiding behind his titles and lets someone hold his fear, his softness, his breath. This isn't a tale of conquest. It's a quiet revolution, one that says you are still allowed to want. You are still allowed to be touched. You are still allowed to feel desire, not to prove anything, but simply because you are still alive. We tell ourselves that aging is a slow disappearance. That desire has an expiration date. That softness, that longing, that ache to be touched, those belong to younger men, faster bodies, easier nights. But maybe the truth is quieter. Maybe desire doesn't vanish. It deepens, it softens, it trades thunder for tremble, urgency for presence, power for connection. And maybe you don't need to chase youth to feel alive again. Maybe you just need to remember that you're still allowed to want, to be held, to be seen, to be loved not for the man you were, but for the man you are still becoming. If this story spoke to something in you, some quiet place you thought no one else could see, stay with us. There are more stories like this, more unspoken truths, more gentle confessions. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave a comment, even just a few words. You never know who's reading it, and realizing they're not alone. Thank you for being here. Until next time, keep breathing, keep feeling, and keep becoming.